Aloha mai kako. Just this. All right. I want to break this short story into three parts, starting with family, and then starting about ecosystems, and then ending with education. And I'm going to begin with a story about my father. And one of my earliest memories of working with my father is him fully clad in beekeeping suit with a veil, beekeeping gloves up to his elbows, a hive tool and a smoker in his hand. And we're about to enter into a cluster of bee hives that he's set up adjacent to our house in the Santa Cruz Mountains of California, where I was raised. And he's been keeping bees for years, and he's attempting to introduce me to the art and practice of beekeeping. I, on the other hand, am not in a full beekeeping suit. He's given me a hand-me-down veil to cover my head and my face, and I'm wearing a pair of jeans, a wool sweater that I've tucked into my pants, and my wool sweater is covering a set of gardening gloves that I've secured with rubber bands. I've tucked my pants into my wool socks, and I'm ready to go. So my dad looks at me and he says, "You ready?" So it's cool coastal California fog, and it's beginning to clear. The air temperature is relatively low, which, for those of you who know anything about bees, the interior of bee colonies, the bees try to maintain at a temperature somewhere around 90 degrees. Bees don't like it when large mammals go into their colonies and start messing around because they're trying to protect their developing baby brood. So, needless to say, you may have anticipated that things did not go well for me that day. The bees find their way into my defenses. I get stung through my sweater and various places on my body. I flee the scene, yelling for my mom to help. So my dad eventually catches up, swats away the remaining bees, attempts to console me, and of course laughs a little bit because he's gone through the same thing previously. I didn't particularly find his sense of humor very funny at the time, but anyhow, I did return to keeping bees with him after that experience, and I began to love it. And in my household, during the time of, this is in the early 1970s, before a lot of pests and pathogens began to affect honeybees in California, our household had two 55-gallon drums of honey in our garage. And my parents would give away jars of honey to our neighbors and our friends and our family members. And people didn't even know what to do with it at the time. And these experiences formed my deep interest in insects, and I later went on to keep bees at the UC Santa Cruz Farm and Garden Project, where I worked for about a decade, and I taught generations of people how to keep bees. And later I pursued a PhD degree in insect ecology. And so even to this day, even though I'm an academic and I do research and mostly teaching, those formative experiences still are deeply compelling to me. I love social insects, I love honey, I love bees and bee behavior. So after many years, I continue to do this work, and it's been a formative experience in my life, starting with my father. My mother, she was a home gardener, and she was a canner, she was a cook, and she spent a great deal of her time tending to a garden at our home in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And she canned everything under the sun: peaches, nectarines, pickles, chutneys, and that was something that she filled our cabinets with. And so I come from a home, even though it was fairly modest in means, where food was a central element in our lives. They cherished their relationship to bees and gardening and sharing food with my sister and I and our neighbors. One of the things I actually was calling my mom this morning to ask her, I wanted her to essentially fact check some of this story. And one of the things she revealed to me that I had never heard her say before is she said, you know, Albie, the reason that I was doing that, the reason that I was so interested in tending to a garden and learning these basic skills of self-subsistence was because the Vietnam War was still raging, and she was concerned about her ability to actually take care of her family because of the social upheaval that was happening at the time during the close of the Vietnam War. So now I want to talk a little bit about ecosystems and the ecosystems in which I was raised. So I was raised in the coastal part of California in the Santa Cruz Mountains. This is just outside of the Silicon Valley. My parents fled San Jose, where I was born. They left that area at the time, and this is again early 1970s, they left because all of the orchards, the peaches, the apricots, the nectarines were being razed. They're building industrial development, they're building housing tracts. That became the Silicon Valley. And they left to create a new relationship to nature and raise their kids in a place that they thought was more healthy. The community that they moved into, however, this is again in the early 1970s, this is a point of convergence in the Santa Cruz Mountains occupied by people like my parents who were back to the landers, kind of quasi-hippie folks, Hells Angels, and the logging community, which you might imagine at times there was some tension. As a kid, I spent a lot of time playing in the second growth redwood forest. This was an area that was clear cut, you know, in the early part of the last century. I played around the riparian corridors of what's called Boulder Creek formerly, that flows into a river called the San Lorenzo River that eventually empties into the Monterey Bay. This is the southernmost part of salmon fisheries. There's still viable population of salmon that occupy some of the rivers and streams in this area. And during the warm part of the year, albacore tuna are tumble. The waters get warm enough, not like Hawaii, but warm enough that the tuna come in close to Santa Cruz. And the fisher folks can bring in both salmon and albacore, and you can buy it fresh off of the boats there in Santa Cruz. As an adolescent, I swam and I surfed in the Monterey Bay, and later I worked in the state park system repairing trails after the Loma Prieta earthquake. That was one of my jobs for many years, as was my sister's. I learned to gather mushrooms in the forest there, and eventually I learned to keep bees as an adult, and eventually learned to farm there. I spent a lot of my time immersed in the mixed evergreen forests, in the coastal prairie grasslands, and in the chaparral plant communities of that area. Those are places that are dominated by plants like oak trees and madrone trees and knobcone pine, Doug fir forests. The coastal prairie grassland, these unique ecosystems, are dominated by perennial bunch grasses that may live for 70 or 80 years. The chaparral communities are dominated by species like coyote bush, baccharis, and a range of other species of plants that thrum with insects during the flow of nectar. These are ecosystems where you find red-tailed hawks and hermit thrushes and a range of other bird species. There's California condors in this area, golden eagles, bobcats, mountain lions are all present in these ecosystems. It's a small pocket of relatively intact ecosystems on the central coast of California. There's rich kelp forests just off of the coastline of California in Santa Cruz and along the Monterey Bay. And great white sharks annually come into the Monterey Bay to feed off of the elephant seals that are being birthed at Año Nuevo, just north of Santa Cruz. As a teen, I surfed and skated in abandoned swimming pools, and I was interested in, perhaps oddly enough, political punk rock. I was very interested in the young artists at the time who were raging against the abuse of animals, against the oppression of other people. And in particular, I had friends in a punk rock band who raged against the idea of mutually assured destruction during the Cold War with the former Soviet Union. These are the ideas that were populating my mind as a young man. My friends are mostly raised by single moms. They surfed, smoked a lot of weed, drank too much, worked in construction, and played music. When I was 19, the band that I was playing with, they moved off to Los Angeles because they were going to make it. And at that time, I decided, I think I'm going to go to college and fulfill a dream that my parents were not able to fulfill for themselves. So I'm going to talk about my education, which is somewhat circuitous. I started at a community college in California. It's called Cabrillo College. And the first couple of years there I found to be absolutely tedious, as some of you who've gone through the college experience might find, until I enrolled in a zoology class. And I met this man named John Carruthers. And John Carruthers actually did his PhD work here in Hawaii. And John is kind of famous in my house because he took me on a number of kind of life-changing adventures, including one to rural Costa Rica. And once we settled into this remote ecological research center, and he gave a detailed lecture on convergent evolution and mimicry, he accidentally grabbed a deadly coral snake by the tail, assuming that it was a king snake, its biological mimic, and he threw it into a group of us students. He didn't learn his own lessons. He also took me on a trip to Hawaii, and where he studied Hawaiian lobelia, the opelu, and Hawaiian honey creepers, the amakahi. And we traveled across the islands, and I learned for the first time the geology, the biogeography, the flora and fauna of Hawaii. We ate poi, poke, and papaya at the Red Cinder Cone Beach on Maui. And with John, I learned about the destructive force of industrial agriculture on biodiversity and people. We floated down the ditches of the East Maui irrigation project that's, as you know, diverts vast volumes of water, and I learned then, at the expense of indigenous peoples and ecosystems of Hawaii. And this stayed with me. My focus in school then sharpened intensely. I began to study environmental science. Agriculture and food became my principal interest. And everywhere I turned, I began to see the destructive forces of agriculture on the natural world and its negative consequences to human beings. And I remember feeling that it didn't have to be this way. We didn't have to do agriculture in this very destructive way. So at my four-year college in Northern California, I was farming olives and plums, growing corn and beans with a group of kind of hippie farmers. I took courses in environmental science simultaneously and learned at the time about anthropogenic climate forcing. And at the time actually did the calculations to determine what was the level of anthropogenic warming at the time. This is 1992. And it was less than 1 degree Celsius, about 0.85 degrees Celsius. I also took an environmental ethics class, which transformed my thinking, and I was asked several important questions that continue to kind of shape my thinking today. And some of my students are here today, and they're going to know some of these questions because I've turned around and asked them the very same questions. And they're questions like, what is the moral status of non-human beings? What is the spiritual value of the natural world and its inhabitants? And how are we to live our lives in ways that recognize these values? So what, how, and for whom we produce food is an inseparable part of these questions for me. These are things that I think about every day, and I try to communicate elements of this in the work that I do with my students. And it's in part why I'm here today and why I do the work that I do here in Hawaii. And it shaped my relationship to food and agriculture and a larger food system. So kind of driven by these values, these kind of penetrating questions, I decided to move back to California and to Santa Cruz, where I participated in what's called the Apprenticeship in Ecological Horticulture. And there I learned to farm organically. It's the oldest organic farming training program in the nation, started in 1967. And there I worked for 2 years training intensively in organic horticulture, learning about organic farming and biodynamics. And we learned to prepare soil, produce compost, propagate plants, do crop planning, all the things similarly as people are being trained in the Go Farm program. But we did it over 6 months to a 2-year period for people like myself. To this day, living and working on that farm at UC Santa Cruz was probably the richest educational experience I've ever had. We worked from sunrise to sunset, and our entire lives were dedicated to learning about organic farming and gardening and consuming the foods that we produce there. And it's something that I attempt, perhaps imperfectly, to translate that type of relationship to the land through an academic program, really combining theory and practice. So after a couple of years of study at Santa Cruz, I got the harebrained idea that what I wanted to do was grow all of my own food and live off of my own food. And so I got a plot of land and I began growing corn, beans, squash, amaranth, and a range of other plants that I knew that were nutritionally sound and could fulfill my basic physiological needs. So needless to say, this is not something that most people do. And I quickly realized that, the culture that I existed in wasn't really supportive of somebody doing this kind of life work. Learning from the academics at UC Santa Cruz, I began to understand that there's, of course, these larger social, economic, and political obstacles to our realizing greater ecological sustainability, social equity, human health, and the food system. So I began to focus away from this idea of self-subsistence and more toward addressing structural obstacles in the food system. And so I began to focus on structural issues, and I organized conferences in California, conducted a number of research projects. I served as an editor at the Center for Agroecology for a number of years, and formed a national organization called the Sustainable Agriculture Education Association that was really dedicated to changing the way that agriculture is taught in colleges of agriculture around the US. In 2003, I shipped off to Rome to work at the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, Italy. They had an organic agriculture program there. And our task was to really document the state of the organic food industry in every member nation around the world. I remember living in Rome for a short period of time, and it was one of the massive heat waves that hit Europe. And you would go into one of the bodegas, and literally chocolate was melting off of the shelves. The storekeepers couldn't keep the places cool because in Rome, as some of you may know, they don't have the ability to provide AC to all of these buildings. Tens of thousands of people died in this single heat wave that struck Europe. So this stuck in my head. So after many years of doing this work, some of which was international, in 2006 I enrolled in a PhD program at Berkeley. I saw myself being in a position of becoming a teacher, and so I pursued a PhD at Berkeley, and I spent 7 years studying insect ecology in order to understand how we could transform elements of vineyard culture in California to reduce pesticide use. And so I completed that. And one of the things that really stuck with me while at Berkeley is I met people like Ignacio Chapela, people like Tyrone Hayes. These names may be familiar with you. These are people who did important science in the public interest, but were attacked by industry for the research that they did. And that too stayed with me. There's an important politics of food that we also have to be cognizant of. So after graduating from Berkeley in 2013, I pursued a job here at the University of West Oahu, a new campus. They were interested in developing a new program that they called Sustainable Community Food Systems. I made friends with Gary and Kukui at Ma'o Farms, And my daughter Jeju was 1.5 at the time. She's now almost 10. And since then, we've built a program. We call it Sustainable Community Food Systems. I have a couple of students here tonight. The intention of that program is to kind of smushing all this weird life experience together to help people understand systemically, think about the food system critically and systemically, to help them understand the food and agricultural sector as a complex social ecological system that we can change, that we can modify through time, and can direct it toward achieving greater public health and ecological sustainability. And since we've built that program, I think that by virtue of, the intelligence and brightness of some of the students that come through my program that I've had the fortune to meet, I think we're starting to have some impact. So that brings me to the present moment. I stand here today as the adult me, but much like the young me with my dad, facing a number of honeybee colonies, I feel a certain kind of vulnerability and uncertainty about what's going to happen next. Given the context of global environmental change, I'm deeply concerned about how prepared I am, how prepared we are to confront the realities of the Anthropocene. Changes, both good and bad, are accelerating. So, in closing, I would say that despite the significant challenges that we face, I trust our collective intelligence and potential. The current moment has presented us with an opportunity to come together and articulate a common vision and a pathway forward. And through this pathway, I hope we can better realize the intrinsic value of human and non-human life. And that's what I'm here to do, and that's what I hope to do with you. Thank you.